We now charge into a session on dialogue on data and purposeful partnership. In light of the conversations that we've been having around collaboration, I think it's imperative for us to think about what truly holds partnerships together and how do they become meaningful in the long run. Furthermore, the conversation would highlight the power of data for good that fuels partnerships with efficiency and accountability. The session is a dialogue between Jean Oelwang, the founding president and trustee of Virgin Unite, who has written the book Partnering in 2022, laying down the most crucial levers that build deep connections. Jean, if you're here, please do join us on stage.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's been a wonderful couple of days with Dasra, and I'm so glad to be here today. Last night, I was fortunate to be at a gathering with a number of you, and someone got up and said, data is really important for the social sector, and we really suck at it. And I thought that would be a good way to kick us off today, because we at data.org, as a platform for partnerships to build the field of data for social impact, are trying to make the social sector suck less with data. And that is our primary mission, and in order to drive social impact. Jean?
Thank you, Perry. I can't wait to hear how you're going to make it suck less. So excited about the data side. I also just want to say thanks to Aksha for introducing us. And I love his name, Never Ending. It's a perfect name to talk about partnerships because we want them to be never ending. I also want to say thanks to Dasra, and particular Aditi Premji, who has been talking about Dasra for years to me. And so I know a million things about you. So it's an honor to be here with you guys in the room today. And I work for Virgin Unite, as Aksha mentioned, and we're a little bit like a small entrepreneurial incubator that really challenges unacceptable issues and systems for good, and everything we do is in collaboration. So it's an honor to be here having this conversation, and I can't wait. I'm going to actually, Perry, if you're okay, I'm going to ask you the first question, so I throw it, because I'd love just to hear, because data is so important to us at the center of all of our collaborations. So I would love to hear just from you about what you've seen of the importance of data as you set up these kind of collaboratives and collaborations.
Thanks so much. So data is obviously essential to all that we do. And in terms of thinking about collaboratives, what it does is it gives you a shared set of findings and connection points in order to assign, measure, and report on progress. So data is absolutely critical as a component, but I think we're doing data wrong in a lot of ways. I think we're getting incomplete data, we're getting inaccurate data, or we're collecting it in the wrong way. So all those attributes mean we need to think about data differently. Another piece is that we need to think about how we marry data with qualitative findings. I think so often data is treated as, okay, here's your dashboard, all right, now you know what to do. But without thinking about the qualitative context in which the data resides, it's very hard to make lasting social impact change.
And can you share just a couple maybe examples of that qualitative data linked to the data?
So we did a project with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation a couple of years ago, where there's often a lot of pressure from funders to say, hey, get it and get it fast, right? Get us those numbers, and we want to see those charts up and to the right. Well, believe me, we like to see the charts up and to the right as well. But it's really important to make sure that the data is collected in the right way. At data.org, we think a lot about localism and inclusion. So who's collecting the data? Which fields are we assigning? Why did we choose those? There's a question about the who, and there's also a question about the how. How is that data being collected? Is it being collected in a culturally accessible, culturally context way that makes a difference so that the data you get is right? And when you have that qualitative lens on the data, and you've brought people together to discuss the kind of data, only then do you have the trust that you need in order to make the actual data you're collecting is correct and can move your problem forward. Great. So you mentioned the ozone project to us a little bit in the room. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, for sure. And I'd love to just ask the audience a couple questions before I tell that story. And you have to stop me if I'm talking too long because I'm obsessed by the ozone story. But who in the room has had a good collaboration? Okay, who in the room has had a bad collaboration? Okay, so you're all normal. That's good. Collaborations are hard. They're not easy, and I think that's the first thing we need to almost start with. And another quick question to everyone in the room. So who in the room knows who discovered and then helped protect the ozone layer? Okay. These two are cheating because they're from the Virgin Unite team. So this is the same route, the same answer. I've gone into thousands of rooms, thousands of people, and it's the same answer. I think only 2 people in the world that I've come across that are in Australia that would have gotten impacted by the ozone layer deeply were the only ones that could actually answer that question. And I really believe that the reason we can't answer that question is because it wasn't a single superhero. It was actually a collaborative, a collective, and they were from people from all over the world. I think it's probably one of the greatest examples where, as a human achievement, collaboratively, we did something that is a success story. Because around 2065, the ozone layer will be largely, the hole will be largely healed. And I guess I think we have a lot to learn from this community that did this. And a couple things that we've learned as we've studied them is, it started really with data and with science. It started with 2 incredible scientists in a small lab in California, and then the British Antarctic Survey, because they had looked at scientific data from 1957 through to the 80s, they were able to see trends and prove that there was a hole near the South Pole. And so with that, they had this amazing, intoxicating purpose that they could rally people behind. And I think that's probably lesson number 1 that we learned from them, is that having that intoxicating purpose that people in the collaborative really keep as their North Star. And I think no collaborative will work unless you have the fundamental principles of virtues at the center. And the 3 that we found were most important were trust and respect as a close sister to trust, and then belief in one another. And the other things that they did so well is that they were all in. Like, we had some of them here this week to honor them. And some of them have been working on this close to 50 years now, and they're still all in. And they did that by setting up these things that Mustafa Tolba from Egypt called Start and Strengthen, where when they had conflict, they didn't try to get everyone in the room to agree. They took a handful of people that they knew were willing, had them take off their cloaks of authority, and then had them really argue and go through different arguments about why they didn't want to come to the table in negotiations. And so by the time they put their cloaks of authority back on and walked out of the room, they had answers rather than solutions rather than problems. And there's a whole bunch of other things we can talk about if we have time.
That's super compelling. And also thinking about how do you avoid the tyranny of consensus in a collaborative? And that sounds like one way to do it, right? You have people arguing their case versus every single person has to be 100% brought in all the time.
Yeah, and what they did is they called it relational, ended up calling it relational scaffolding. They thought through every detail so that they built relationships at every step of the way, and they built these deep connections. And we studied many great human achievements like ending smallpox in India, also things like ending apartheid in South Africa, and closing the ozone hole. And at the center of all of these were these incredible deep connections. And they had to build those relationships over time, which was just amazing to see how they did that.
So putting my marketing hat on, does anyone know who invented the light bulb? Right? Raise your hand if you know someone who invented the light bulb. That gives you an idea. So one of the challenges, I think, of collaboratives is nobody knew who solved the ozone problem, right? Everyone is hard to identify with. People want stories. So this week we released a series called Under Over about gender and data. And I would say of the women we interviewed, 9 out of 10 would say, you know, I played the leading role, but I wasn't really the leader. It was really this collaborative of women, and we all worked together, and we all got it done. You know, when you interview men, not all men, but most men will say, oh, yeah, it was me. It was Dave. I did it. It's done. We're in good shape. But it's hard to tell a story about a collaborative or a collective. It's hard to rally people around it. So I think by describing the Ozone Project, the thing you guys got right was focusing on the solution and not on the solver. I think that changes the dialogue fundamentally. But there's also, I think, an interesting role, from Indian culture, Greek culture, Roman culture. People like stories, and people like heroes of stories. So how do you manage to empower collaboratives and collectives to solve problems, but yet find ways to laud heroes so that people can relate to them and sign on to the project?
Yeah, and I think stories are so important, and us going back into history and finding where we really did it, because we need to radically collaborate at a scale we can't even begin to imagine if we want to solve some of our interconnected problems. So learning from where we got it right and sharing those stories, because you're right, they haven't been told in a way that captures people's imaginations, and I think that's what we need to do right now. It was interesting because at the center of all of these was something that was common in all of them, which was humility. And, I would probably call it informed confidence. Because it's not about releasing our egos. We all have egos. We're all going to have egos. It's about taming our egos and having the informed confidence to know what we're good at, but also knowing who else in the room needs to come in. And all of these great human achievements were these humble people at the center that made this happen. And that's how they were able to get so many different voices and people in the tent. But I'd love, because you're doing something really cool around pandemics right now with Equiverse, which is trying to mobilize people all over the world around looking at the next pandemic. I'd love to hear how you're doing that.
Thank you. So Epiverse is a global collaborative focused on building data analysis and data tools so that we can identify, prevent, and respond to the next epidemic. And it involves both the technology, right? How do we create digital public goods that are accessible, usable, and solves the problem of data being collected in different ways across boundaries, whether those boundaries are state by state in the US, that was even a problem during COVID, or country by country, is really important. But it's also about creating, I don't know if my colleague Uwe Stewart is here, his favorite word in the whole world is ecosystem. And it's about creating an ecosystem of both developers and technical people building these tools, and among them, field epidemiologists who are engaging with those tools so that countries can adopt them and prevent the next pandemic. But I think that's a collaborative, right? It's a collaborative of people trying to solve a shared problem. And I do think it can be challenging because you don't have the hero stories. And you have to avoid the tragedy of the commons, right? If a lot of people work on things like open source projects, it's really hard to make sure that those are well supported. But that's the problem with the support from the Rockefeller Foundation and Welcome we are trying to solve.
And what are some of those challenges that you've banged into in building this collaborative, or any collaborative?
I think a lot is around the tools ownership. How do you make sure that tools are adequately supported and owned? And support for that within the community. And I think also making sure that different parts of the community feel equally valued in the conversation. We're so fortunate to work with not only the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, but an organization in the Gambia that's affiliated with them, but also two wonderful universities in Colombia, Javeriana and Los Andes, who are making huge contributions to this. But you have to work across cultures and work across assumptions to make it happen. We talked a little bit about code switching when we were in the room. And I think that's, if you have to say what makes collaboratives work well, what makes people work well across boundaries, I do think it's that ability to code switch. It's that ability to say, your cultural context may be different than my cultural context, but how can we come together around this shared goal? And that's something, quite frankly, we face as a challenge at data.org with staff members in India and Germany and France and the UK and the US, is how do we make sure that we're communicating well, communicating thoroughly, and are united around our shared goals.
And I think a lot of that comes back to trust and respect. And I remember when COVID first started, we hopped on a call with a few foundations to say, okay, what could we be doing on the African continent? What difference could we make? And we learned quite quickly after that first call that there wasn't enough African voices on that call. So we gained and joined forces with the Africa CDC and the Africa Public Health Foundation. And for, I think, over 2 years, so 140 weeks, 104 calls, it was just amazing because it was about 25 to 100 foundations on every call that were all doing work on the continent, but they weren't talking to each other. So the poor Africa CDC was getting 100 different requests and asks, but by putting Africa CDC and John Nkengasong, who's just extraordinary, in the lead, so he was guiding every one of those calls, and what they were doing at the Africa C was guiding the calls. That helped it just become so much more efficient and effective. And now, from a data perspective, what's super exciting is the new John Nkengasong, so Dr. Jean Kaseya, is actually super excited about data because Africa can leapfrog the rest of the world by putting in the right data systems from a health perspective and gathering it from the different continents. And I have to say the African continent was one of the greatest examples of collaboration during COVID rather than self-interest that I've ever seen, run by Strive Massawia, Ngozi, Cyril Ramaphosa, who rather than just trying to grab PPE and vaccines for one country on the continent, they created an entire platform that then, a digital platform that then allowed every single country across the African continent to access PPE and vaccines at the same price point. So they negotiated on a continent scale. And it was just amazing to watch.
No, I love your point about localism because that's so core to what we do. We find that unless you have people on the ground who are invested in collecting the right data, acting on that data, and reporting on that data, you can go wrong so quickly. So to having someone lead that conversation is vital. But I want to pick up on something you said about trust. We spoke a little bit about trust being essential to partnerships. And that's something that we found takes time and cost to build. So putting your funder hat on, sometimes I feel like we'll propose a project and say, oh, we need these in-person meetings. We need to take the time to build trust because we believe that without that trust, it actually costs you more in the long run if you haven't built that groundwork. And that's both trust across cultures, but scoping of the project and making sure everyone is aligned with not only the goals of the project, but the means of the project. But that can get expensive. So how do you think about that as a funder? How do you allocate for that in your projects that you lead?
Yeah, a really good question. I think I have to say right up front that I think philanthropy is deeply broken, and I think we need to earn trust again because philanthropists have broken trust by the way they treat people all over the world. So I feel like we need to flip that upside down and revolutionize how we do philanthropy and do it more in a partnership model rather than a give or take, however you want a donor, et cetera model. So I feel like first we have to reinvent and reimagine that. And it has to start from a baseline of trust, but linked to respect of knowing that everyone is bringing to the table something and everyone can learn from one another. And I think so often, again, we let our egos or we let our organizations get in the way and come to the table not with that sense of open-heartedness around respect and trust and belief in one another. But you're right, it takes time, and your point is super important. And giving that time is really, really having that space for honest and open conversations, because I think sometimes things go unsaid, and then trust gets broken. And knowing, I think having at the very front end really clear roles and responsibilities, understanding that North Star, that intoxicating purpose, helps build trust because it lifts you above the mucky day-to-day, things that don't matter as you're all going towards something bigger. But giving yourself the space for that. And, one thing that I love, which is something that Airbnb did that we actually stole, is they created time once a month with their team. And they did something called elephants, dead fish, and vomit. And I never, ever thought I would say those three words in one sentence. But they got their team into a meeting once a month, and they would allow people to talk about the elephants in the room that no one was talking about. They would allow people to talk about the dead fish that everyone was talking about, but no one was doing anything about. And then they would allow everyone just to vomit the things that they needed to get off their shoulders. And what they said is that space just created this extended level of trust because people weren't holding things in. They had a chance to talk about it. And so I think thinking about how we do that with the collaboratives we build, how do you create those spaces that people can really have the honest, open conversations that often we don't because we're too polite or because we don't want to hurt someone. In the end, we end up hurting each other even more, and then we break trust.
And share their anxieties. So this morning there were some interesting comments about collaboratives of how do you think about attribution, right? How do you know that my extra dollars that I put into this collaborative were the ones that ended up, solving child poverty in this one region? So how do you think about the attribution challenge for collaboratives and where data fits into that?
Yeah, this is a super important point. And we have, over the years, we've helped incubate about 18 different collaboratives, collectives of leaders. This is something that's always at the top of our mind. And I think in some cases, attribution, and it's never our attribution in work, it's actually always the frontline partners. So I want to make that really clear. So if we're lucky enough to find an incredible partner who does incredible work on the ground, we're happy that impact, and you'll be able to attribute it to that partner. But with groups, for example, like the Elders, which is a group of global leaders that were brought together by Mandela and his wife Graça, and I think there are 15 global leaders that work behind the scenes on peace and human rights, it's really hard to attribute any type of, because they're usually when they're working somewhere, whether it's in Zimbabwe, whether it's in China and Korea, it's really hard to attribute to that one group and that one conversation. So they have a beautiful rule where they don't ever take attribution, they don't ever take credit. And so it makes it a lot simpler. Donors have to embrace that if they're gonna come in and fund them and realize that they're making the shots with people on the ground rather than with the donors. And so I think that's a beautiful example. But I think you're right that so often donors get pressure that they have to attribute something. And sometimes, and it's absolutely spot on in many cases, because you have to prove where your money is making an impact. But in other cases, I think it's okay to say, we can't take attribution because we're actually doing this collaboratively and globally.
That makes sense. Thanks. So one of the roles we see in developing context is data is so often in the not-for-profit sector married to measurement, evaluation, and learning. Like that is the data role. There's not a chief data officer. It's not focused on programmatic work as much as focused on telling the stories of funders of what does work. So in the context of trust, how do we think about what is the role of data in reporting? Someone said at one of the events I was at recently, like, trust is really important, but science also helps. And I like that line too, a lot, of thinking that we need to build trust. We believe in trust-based philanthropy, but having some sort of metrics is really helpful, hence the giant MEL industry. But as we think about MEL and data moving beyond MEL and developing contexts, what does that look like?
Yeah, and I think data at the center is super important, because in some ways, often in philanthropy, it's almost like we're speeding on the highway at nighttime without our headlights on. And I think what data does is it turns on the headlights. It shows transparently where we should be focusing. It helps a collaborative stay together, because then they know what direction they should be headed in, and they know if it's working or not working. Like we just launched something on Monday, and Aditi's been helping us with this from the very beginning and giving her wisdom into it. And it's called Planetary Guardians. And it's this amazing scientist, Johan Rockström, who worked with 29 scientists from all over the world to create this planetary boundaries model that creates 9 subsystems that show where we sit against not just climate change, but also biodiversity, also land use, also chemical pollution. And it allows us to have a holistic perspective on what we're doing. But most importantly, it allows us to know where our priorities are, where the gaps are, because then we're overflowing capital flow maps on that, and philanthropy and commercial. So it gives us this kind of guiding North Star that almost stops the debates and the arguments that often we get into that waste time, and it allows a collaborative effort to run faster.
I would say with the proviso, if you're sure what you collect is the right stuff and you've collected it the right way, which is not trivial, right? So you use the metaphor of the headlights. I'd say data can either be a clear reflection of your progress or it can be a funhouse mirror. And it really depends on how you collected that data, what data you collected. We hosted an event on gender data earlier this week, and someone reported, I think it was like a respiratory study funded by a very, very reputable organization. And in that study, they had the comprehensive scan of who would benefit from this respiratory drug or treatment or therapy was men 18 to 40. Well, we have those guys because they're in the military, and elite athletes. And that was the entire set upon which this study was based. So I think if you don't have the right data, you don't have the right examples, it's not headlights at all. It can be something very pernicious.
And Per, I'd love you to share, maybe if you don't have the right data, have you seen something where you've worked with a partner and there's been unintended consequences from that, of having the wrong data?
Absolutely. So, when we collect data, we try and make sure that it's both locally collected, but also we think about what are the ways that the data will be used in the future. But there are examples in the field of where there's incomplete data. I'm on the board of a small nonprofit called Solar Sister, and the way the data has been collected has left these unintended gaps where you think you're empowering women with clean stoves, but they've actually answered questions very differently based on how it was collected. And the unintended consequence is that women underreported the number of mouths to feed in their household. So without that cultural context in data collection, you could go pretty far afield very quickly.
And just following up on that question, because you're doing some super cool stuff with AI right now. You just did an amazing challenge with generative AI. I'd love to just have you share, like, how do you see AI sitting with forming relationships, like building those deep connections? How do you see the two together?
Well, we were joking, we both got briefings about the other, but they were compiled by humans. Like, will they be compiled by humans in 6 months? So, we see generative AI and AI as something we absolutely have to be at the table for. Just as we want to empower the social sector with data to drive social impact, we believe that AI is going to be so much a part of the conversation that despite the risks, which are many and myriad, we need to be very attuned to the possibilities of AI. So our recent Generative AI Skills Challenge really focused on how do we find organizations in different regions who are using AI to upskill and reskill their workforce. That could be in the AI itself, or it could be in something very different. So that's one of the big areas we see AI forming. And in terms of relationships, I mean, we're already got deep fakes. Like, who's going to be writing our emails? Google keeps telling me to let them write them. So I think pretty soon that will be a reality for us all.
And how many people in this room are frightened of AI versus excited about AI? So I'm going to ask the first one, raise your hand. So how many are frightened of AI? Okay. Okay, how many are excited about AI? Okay, so the latter is more. And you raised your hand twice, so Perry, explain that.
Yeah, I think it's got to be one and the same. I think I was old enough to be part of the first internet boom, and there was just so much techno-utopianism, and it was painful to watch. We'll get in these online communities, and race and class and gender will no longer matter, and everyone will share knowledge and information, and universities will share all their curriculum, and everyone will be a PhD overnight. Guess who completes online PhDs? People who already have PhDs. That's who completes online PhDs. So there was so much techno-utopianism in that era that I think we would be foolhardy not to proceed, but we would be equally foolhardy to proceed with blinders on, believing it's an unqualified good. I see that we have 5 minutes left if we want to take a couple of questions. Or
yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, if anyone. Any questions at all from the audience? Yeah, thank you for being a brave soul.
I would say the world's problems are inextricable now. You know, we live in a world of intersectionality where it's impossible to say, oh, this is about climate, it's not about gender. That's totally different. Stay in your lane. So I think we do a lot of work in financial inclusion, and we see how intimately it's tied to things like climate migration, to things like underserved communities or poor education systems. So because our problems are so interconnected, that solving your problem on its own won't actually solve the problem.
Yeah, and I would also say that to the finance minister that to use your budget efficiently, to make sure that you're doing the right things for your country, you need to actually be listening to the people in your country. And you know, here in the United States, we've had the good fortune to work with an organization called Just Capital. And they've gone out and interviewed hundreds of thousands of people over the last decade now to ask them what a just business is. Because we all sit and pontificate about this is a just business, these are the things you need to have in your company. But what really matters are the people that work with us. What do they think is a just company? So I'd say to the finance minister here in the United States, you know, look at this data. Look at what people on the ground in America want, which is very different than what's happening in the politics in this country. So how do we get down to listening to the people that really matter? And I think we've got so convoluted that we are having the politicians talk to each other and we think that's what matters. Or, you know, the media, you know, and this is something I would have had an hour-long conversation with you about, the non-truths and what's happening right now, particularly in this country, in the United States. You know, how do we stop that from happening? How do we use data to stop that from happening? I'm obsessed and fascinated about how we change the conversation right now so that it stops from being about emotion, about, you know, self-interest, and it becomes about how do we listen to people on the ground so that we make sure that our budgets are being utilized for the right purposes. And it has to be intersectional.
Thank you. That was great. I'm Chandrika Bahadur from the Antara Foundation. We work very closely with the government as a primary collaborator. And the challenge there is when you talk about trust, that's absolutely true. But trust is also predicated on shared values and shared objectives. And one of the challenges with data is if we're working with a partner that has its own data and collects it for its own purposes, back to what you just said about the validity of the data, it becomes challenging to be able to use the same data when we're not sure of the quality of the data, right? Because if you're supporting the public system, the underlying assumption is that that data is what we work with. What ends up happening is that a lot of organizations like mine end up collecting our own information because we want that to be, we believe that is more accurate to guide our programmatic work. Yet when we're looking at outcomes and monitoring outcomes that we're producing jointly with a much larger public system, it is publicly available, officially collected data that we work with. So sometimes there are multiple sources of data, and the question is, how do you balance that?
No, data definitely can reflect multiple truths. I agree with that. And I think one of the ways to combat that is actually what I was speaking about with Epiverse, this idea of digital public goods, of shared public assets. So the more that the social sector can step in and say, no, we believe this is the number of people living in poverty, and that involves something really hard to do, which is share, right? That if you create those data silos, how do you share those with partners, and how do you form teams of organizations who are invested in getting that right data? But I definitely agree that trust is a real challenge when the underlying bedrock of the data is flawed. And we did see a lot of that with COVID, which was the genesis for Epiverse.
And I'd call out to all the philanthropists in this room, because we're in a very, very privileged position that we need to take responsibility for, where we can put risk capital in. We can go in and be that like neutral, because a organization on the front line can't say to the government, you have to change your data, but we can. And we can go in and fund that and do it in a way that brings everyone together. So I would just make a shout out. We don't have any more time. We're running out of time. We need to be audacious. We need to think big. And we need to play that role as a convener and bringing together sectors, because the front line can't do it. The government's not going to do it. And so we're running out of answers. And it has to be all of us that step up and do that, to the philanthropists in the room.
And sunshine is the best disinfectant, right? So the more eyes are on that data, the more we can popularize it, and the more we can tell stories. And yep, sometimes those are hero stories about bringing that data to light, the better.
Yeah, and I'll just do a quick shout out to this amazing organization. It's a good example, this Climate Trace, that's actually, because right now, like if you look at when we're gathering emission data, we're doing it from the polluters actually that are giving us that data. But what they're now doing is they're using data and using AI and machine learning to gather emission data from all over the world using about 300 satellites. It's about 100 organizations that came together. So now they can get down to a building level and determine how much carbon emission is coming from that building. So those are the other kinds of ways to actually get data that's really transparent and just brings the sunshine in, as Perry so beautifully said. Okay. Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah. I'm aware this is a little bit of a North by North panel, so I just want to thank everybody for their attention and their connection. We are here with humility. We're here to learn, and we're here to contribute.
Yeah, and that's perfectly said.
Thank you so much, Jean and Perry. It was such a lovely conversation, and it was amazing how attentive people were through the session. Felt like a small teach-in. Beautiful, and thank you so much once again. A big round of applause for Jean and Perry once again.